Good morning, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Dr. Paul is away today, so I will be anchoring the show alone. Thankfully, I do have a good friend as our guest, former CIA officer Phil Giraldi, who joins us frequently to break things down. And Phil and I are going to talk about the incredible shrinking imminence of the Soleimani attack on the U.S. We're going to follow it from the certainty on the January 3rd, after the January 3rd assassination, to today where things don't seem quite that certain. So I'm gonna lead off. Phil, and I do want to thank you for joining us today from Virginia, my old sweet home. Good. And
thank you for having me on again. This is certainly a time when we want to talk about these things, and there's a lot to talk about.
There is, and there was the New York Times helpfully, in a rare helpful moment, traced some of the statements made by administration officials from the beginning to today. And I think if I can read a few of them, I think it really gives an example as to what's happening with them. And this is on the 3rd, here's what Trump said after they killed him, after they killed Soleimani. Soleimani was plotting imminent and sinister attacks on American diplomats and military personnel, but we caught him in the act. Okay? Here's Pompeo the same day. The decision to eliminate Soleimani was in response to imminent threats to American lives. Here's Brian Hook, which maybe we'll talk about later, the special U.S. representative for Iran. He said Soleimani was planning an attack on U.S. facilities and workers in Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria that would have killed hundreds of Americans. Sounds pretty frightening. Caught him in the act. Then on January 5th, Pompeo was singing a slightly different tune. He said, "It's never one thing, it's a collective. It's a full situational awareness of risk and analysis." Sounds a little less certain. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, said days, weeks that day. And then on the 9th, here's Trump. "We caught a total monster and we took him out. We did it because they were looking to blow up our embassy." That's new information. And then on the 9th, Pompeo starts shifting even more. He says, "There were a series of imminent attacks that were being plotted by Soleimani. We don't know precisely when, and we don't know precisely where." Seems to be a contradiction in those two. And then on the 10th, Trump said, "I think it would have been 4 embassies, could have been military bases, could have been a lot of other things too, but it was imminent." And then yesterday, kind of the bombshell. Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, was on, I think it was on CBS News or NBC News in an interview, and he said, quote, I didn't see one with regard to the 4 embassies, one being intelligence. I share the president's view that probably my expectation was that they were going to go after our embassies." He emphasized in that interview that he never saw a specific piece of intelligence suggesting this as a Secretary of Defense. And then, as Phil helpfully shared this morning, a new piece on the Hill, Trump said basically, it doesn't matter if it was imminent or not, he's a bad guy and I took him out. So Phil, that's a long intro for you to kind of put this all in perspective, the shrinking imminence of the threat to the U.S. from Soleimani.
Well, of course, the reality is here that we've been lied to right from the beginning, that there was no imminent threat of any kind. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that this was a plan to kill this guy and to kill others in the leadership of the Republican Guards. The gentleman in Yemen that was also targeted but not killed is evidence of that. So it's this is something that we're waiting for the opportunity, and the opportunity itself is something that we don't know a whole lot about. The alleged individual who was killed in the attack that started all this, we don't know much about him. I suspect he was a CIA contractor, if indeed he exists. But the other thing I would point out is that there's a big picture here. The United States has done something horrific. And basically, there is a bipartisan support for the killing of this guy. The Democratic Party pushed a war powers resolution that went through last week. First paragraph was all about how horrible this guy is. which is largely a fabrication. And I'll also point out that two Republican senators, having been briefed with the classified background to the imminent threat, were not convinced by it. So this is quite an incredible story.
And not only not convinced, Phil, but and we're talking about Senators Lee and Paul. Senator Lee himself, who's not a super demonstrative guy, he came out visibly fuming. He said, "This is the single worst briefing on military matters I've ever seen." And I know you weren't in there, but speculate as to what might have gone on to get Senator Lee so ticked off.
Yeah, in my time in the agency, I've certainly seen a lot of dog and pony shows in which you have briefers trying to construct a reality which is just not supported by the evidence. And that's exactly what happened here. They basically probably came into the room and went into a 15-minute spiel on how disgusting this person was and how he had killed so many Americans and would love to kill so many Americans more. And then they probably had about 3 minutes on the actual evidence, which of course was nothing and may have been derived from the Israelis, and that's supposed to be enough, you know. In our Congress and in the White House, there's clearly a fixation upon Iran, and Iran is the perpetual enemy, and Iran is the threat against the United States, even though you cannot in any way explain why that is so. And all the facts are twisted around that reality, I'm afraid.
You know, Phil, I don't know if you're a fan, but I'm a big fan of the Godfather movies. And, you know, this does strike me when Michael Corleone is getting his son baptized, you know, the different hits going on here and there, taking out the heads of the other families. Seems like maybe someone else in the administration is a fan of those films as well, but with a different outcome. But you touched on this, Phil, and this was an NBC News reporting about the pre-planned nature of the assassination, because we're told the threat was imminent. Trump said we caught him in the act. We had to take him out immediately. He was about to blow up our embassies. But NBC News is reporting that Trump signed off on the assassination of Soleimani back in June, 7 months ago, if an American was killed by, quote, increased aggression from Iran. And this, I think, raises two issues that I would love to have you comment on. First of all, as we already sort of established, this destroys the imminent threat narrative, which was used to kill him. You know, as Trump claimed he was going to blow up our embassy, we had to do it immediately. The use of the word imminent, I think, is a legal term. And Ambassador Murray from the UK, Craig Murray, had a piece right afterward about how this, the Bethlehem Doctrine, the use of force in an imminent threat that doesn't have to be imminent. And the second, it raises all kinds of questions, I think, about the so-called contractor. And you touched that one again, the contractor who was killed. Who was he or she? Why don't we know anything more about him or her? And it almost sounds like a price was put on this person's head. Any person, anyone out there, we're just waiting for someone to get killed so we can pull the trigger on a pre-authorized assassination.
Yeah, there's been a minimal amount of evidence or information on this guy. I mean, he was allegedly an American citizen, though Iraqi-born, an Iraqi native. That's all that I've seen in the media. I've seen a couple of names ascribed to him, but not very convincing, and not very convincing what his job was. So is this and of course we don't know who actually fired the rounds that killed him, and it was attributed to a militia group affiliated with the Iraqi army, and also with connections in the past to the Iranians. So this was an attribution that we don't have much evidence for either. And all of this has been tied together in some neat package to provide a casus belli for the United States to take the action they did. And the more you look at it, the more unreliable, at a minimum, this story is. We see the evidence that they've been wanting to kill this guy for some time, and I suspect this is all something that was kind of cobbled together when the opportunity came up.
Yeah, it sure is shocking. You know, this is not Osama bin Laden or a non-state actor out there who was just some random terrorist. This is the top general of a country that we're not technically, at least, at war with. What does this do for international law? What does it do for the State Department's claim that, quote, we're a force for good, end quote, in the Middle East, and therefore we're not leaving Iraq even if you ask us to leave?
Yeah, we're essentially blackmailing Iraq right at the moment, using the usual sanctions and Treasury Department issues. And sure, we are not a force for good. We have not been a force for good since 2001. And the fact is that this kind of argument that the United States obeys international law, or that the United States is indeed the banner bearer of international law, is ridiculous. We've assassinated an official of a foreign government, as you noted, which we are not at war, and we did it in a third country, which we're also not at war with. And we did this callously, and we did this with forethought, and we did it in violation of international law and of basic morality.
Yeah, and common sense, right? Because you said we did this to stop a war, not start a war. What would happen if someone assassinated one of our top generals? Not that Americans care much about them, but it certainly would stop a war. And here's another thing that's interesting, and you did touch on it earlier. Two things, actually. First of all, this whole sort of mafia-style hit thing sort of reminds me of the modus operandi of the Israelis, who have for years have been operating, or their agents operating inside Iran, assassinating Iranian scientists and other officials. So this sort of multi-hit on Iranians throughout the region sort of has that feel to it. And in fact, we both read an article today from Haaretz, and it's based on NBC reporting. And this is interesting, that Netanyahu was the only foreign leader in the region who was tipped off as to what was coming. He spoke to Pompeo on the phone just before the assassination, and now Haaretz is reporting that Israeli intelligence played a key role in finalizing the plan to kill Soleimani. So how do you read all this? The Israeli factor, it seems like it's made things much more interesting.
Well, obviously, the United States would carry out an attack like this in deference to Israeli interests. So I'm not surprised that the only foreign player that was involved with this was Israel. And Israel, of course, for all its faults as an intelligence, Mossad's faults as an intelligence agency, Israel has very good sources on the ground, which means people that they would have had in Damascus, where the flight apparently originated, and also upon landing in Baghdad. They would have been able to confirm the location of the plane, of the people, of the passengers, and this was probably decisive and vital information for the United States to have to stage the killing.
Well, we know that Trump and Netanyahu are very close, very, very close. Well, we know that the internal political situation in Israel is pretty complicated. Netanyahu's fighting for his political life and maybe his freedom. What do you think the internal politics in Israel, how does this play it all into the hands of the Israelis in helping push this forward? Is this help Netanyahu show how tough he is?
Well, I think what the intention of, there are two intentions here on the two sides. The intention from Netanyahu is to demonstrate to the Israeli people that he is the guy that can go to the United States, to go to the President of the United States and get things done.
Yeah.
The fact that he was called before the killing shows that they basically were deferring to his judgment on the killing, and he was involved in it. That Netanyahu hopes will get him reelected in March. Now, from the Trump side, Trump obviously wants a quid pro quo from Netanyahu, and he would expect Netanyahu to be enthusiastically on board of the Trump campaign in 2020. So it's a two-way game.
Yeah, that, especially with the American evangelicals, that's probably a pretty important thing. We touched on the propaganda aspect of it, and I think it's important. You mentioned earlier the War Powers Act bill, which you're right. The first thing when I talked to Dr. Paul after reading it, I said, if anything, then this makes the case for killing the guy. He's out there, wantonly killing Americans everywhere he turns. He's the worst guy since Hitler. Oh, but by the way, President, you can't go after this guy who's on a rampage. Completely insane. The Soleimani did the attacks on the embassy. He did the rocket attack. It's just accepted now. He personally fired the rockets into the embassies. He personally went over to the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and lit it on fire and attacked it. He killed 600 Americans. It's just amazing how the propaganda sinks in so that nobody pays attention to whether or not they've been lying all along about this imminent threat.
Yeah, that's the whole point. I mean, if you lie enough, what you're lying about disappears. And all of this stuff, as I'm sure you've read the background pieces, is nonsense. This guy was a senior military officer. He wasn't going around setting IEDs to kill Americans. He wasn't going around and firing rockets at the U.S. Embassy. This guy was way too many levels above that kind of thing. The whole claim that any IED that killed an American in Iraq was the responsibility of this guy is ridiculous. And yet that is precisely the claim that's being made. That's where they come up with this 600 number, the number of American casualties to IEDs. And there has been a lot of research on this subject, and an IED is rather simple. It can be constructed in any metalworking shop. And indeed, the United States forces in 2004, 2005 discovered these shops inside Iraq. There was no Iranian hand in this.
And you may have seen that Matt Ho was in a piece, I think, that Scott Ritter wrote, and he said, I was there at the time, and we knew that these IEDs were Iraqi manufactured, Iraqi placed. This was not Soleimani tiptoeing around, sneaking in these bombs everywhere. But the propaganda still holds, doesn't it? I mean, he killed all of these people. It's go ahead, Phil. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean that's precisely it. It's like Goebbels used to say about the big lie, and we're seeing the big lie in this administration. They never tell the truth. And what should we as Americans do about this? I don't know anymore. We've reached the point where lying has become such a part of our government. And that we citizens, I think, are beginning to get a bit desperate about what are the solutions to this. We don't want a war with people that don't threaten us, and yet we're stuck in the situation where we have a government that doesn't listen to anybody and appears to be completely ignorant and is marching down that road for reasons of dispensationalism, that we want the second coming of Christ. And, the reasons are so ridiculous, but they're out there.
And if we had an opposition party, we might feel a little bit less desperate, But as you pointed out earlier, the Democrat criticism of Trump's move all boils down to, yeah, he was horrible, and it's really great that you killed him, but you should have done a little bit differently. Maybe you should have tipped us off. Maybe you should have had this guy do it, not this way. So there really is no opposition to the core of what happened, as you point out, the enormity of assassinating a senior foreign military official of a sovereign state, which is recognized by the U.S. and the UN. It all boils down to, yeah, it's good that you did it, but you really should have come to us and groveled a little bit first.
That's correct. That's exactly what they said.
It's pathetic. Well, Phil, if maybe you want to wrap it up, because now Trump looks like he's out here hanging. Pompeo and Esper are fighting for their lives. I mean, I wish there were more consequences for their lives, but maybe Trump's being set up for something with Esper and Pompeo backing out of their certainty that it was imminent. Where do you see things heading as we move away from the accepted narrative?
Well, I think the one encouraging thing about all of this is that the Iranians, for whatever reason, there may have been messages exchanged, but for whatever reasons, the Iranians have chosen not to escalate this. Now, if we can see anyone within the White House with our current administration exercising similar restraint, we just might escape this without starting World War III. But, this is really serious stuff. I can't think of an example of anything even similar to this, assassinating a senior official since Yamamoto. And with Yamamoto in 1945, we were at war. In this case, we were not at war with these people, and we're assassinating their senior officials. I mean, this is just incredible. This is something that I, as an American growing up, would have never expected my government to do. And but we're in a different game now, and I think Americans have really got to wake up to just how horrific there is. And someday, if we keep doing this kind of stuff, the chickens are going to come home to roost, and we will find we have no friends anywhere in the world, and that will be very bad.
That's great. Well, thanks very much for your perspectives, Phil. It's always great to have you here. And I want to thank our viewers for today's Liberty Report. Thanks for coming back. We're in a dangerous situation. It doesn't seem like either of the parties care at all about preventing a massive war that will be very destructive to our economy and to our lives and to our standing in the world. The only thing I think we can do, and we're seeing a little bit of it, is to do some protesting. I think we need a broad left-right coalition, which is what the Ron Paul Institute is all about, the broadest coalition possible and focusing specifically on war itself. So we are focusing. We're doing our best. Thank you for joining us. Please come back tomorrow and watch the Liberty Report.